So first, I tend to argue that we are at a critical juncture in time. This is a time when we have seen that global financial markets were in urgent need for more institutions. There is more systemic risk that's appearing, just in finance, but also in climate change and energy and all sorts of issues. And we're also at a time, the last decade, where we are really at a time of great rebalancing of power, where we have seen the biggest shift of the biggest transfer in economic power from the OECD to non-OECD ever seen since 1945. So in this context, the game has really centered around the theme of global governance. There is a need to revise, refurbish, enhance all the institutions that we've had since 1945, also to build new ones or to adjust to the functional needs we have. And the game has crystallized around G20. Because there are other alternatives, right? There was G5, G7, G8, and now it's proving too small. We really need the emerging markets in there. The US has been toying with the G2 idea. If anything could be agreed between US and China, in general, other countries will have to bandwagon. But those don't work. UN is too large, so G20 is about the largest you can get while bringing enough big powers. And so now within that context, it could look like a table with 20 countries, seeking common goods. But in practice, there's almost 3 tiers. I see 3 tiers in that G20 game. There are the 3 elephants, and this is indeed US, Europe, and China. They are those who, we have the most power, we have the biggest interests, and without whom you cannot move forward. So they have to acquiesce to anything. Then there's a second tier of the medium players, or the sort of mediators, who can have a major role in crafting the bargain, so bringing the 3 together, but they are not in the same level, and that includes Japan, Korea, I put here, also Brazil, India, Russia. And then we have all the other smaller countries like Argentina, Turkey, etc. who haven't yet played a big role in the game. So it's really different. And in that triad, the triad is the core. And within that game, I see that there is, at least the early G20s have seen a bit of a polarization between US and Europe. Europe trying to push for more than just a crisis committee, but a new Bretton Woods, a new global governance, a great deal. And the US seeking to resolve the great crisis of 2008, but without committing to a high regulatory agenda beyond that. And so that puts China in the middle, and China is watching. It's a game that's really new for China. They're not used to it. But that's roughly how I see the early G20 game. So this is what I call the Northeast Asian paradox about the G20. And it started from an observation, right? On one hand, we see more and more trade integration. The last 10 years have been another critical juncture where, Korea or Japan, for example, used to have 20-25% of trade with the US. Now they've been replaced by China. China is about 22% of exports for both Korea and Japan. So the last 10 years is a time of great regional integration. More and more market-driven trade flows, investment flows. And of course, we know it's not followed by much regional integration at the political level. But so I was looking at this cluster, and more integrated on one hand, and the other side, having interviews with some players of the G20, looking at what happened even in Paris, the last February G20 ministerial meeting, we observed that they really are not coordinating. They even have open clashes at the G20 meetings. And this contrasts greatly to the Europeans, for example, who have a lot of coordination. Even the BRICS, including China, have preliminary meetings in general and coordinate a bit more. So of course, the immediate answer is to say, well, China is, superpower, emerging superpower, and is a developing country. Korea and Japan are developed countries. The interests are different. There are different security interests. So that's the usual response. But looking a bit more in depth, I think I found that there is actually a lot of commonalities that go deeper than just regional. In particular, all 3 are trading nations. They have great current account surpluses. They have huge reserves, all in dollars. So when China talks of of a dollar trap, having put all these reserves in dollars and not being able to diversify or having much say in the monetary system. That's a problem that Japan has had for much longer, since the 80s, and Korea is in the same situation. All three have either suffered or concerned about financial volatility, capital flow volatility. So there's a lot of similarities, and that's not expressed in G20. And when I probed this with the actors, in general, from the Chinese side, I got a response that said, actually, this is correct. There is a paradox here. And in a way, this is a novel question. This is one where in a way, there's a lack of past dependence, a lot of institutionalism, a lot of habit of working together. Korea and Japan are more used to coordinate with the US. Japan was more used to a G7 framework. China is playing multiple games at the same time and hasn't yet prioritized this particular game. So for all kind of reasons, and also security reasons, that somehow foreign policy and security interests have so far trumped over the pure economic interests. I think we haven't seen that happening. But I tend to see this as an arbitrage opportunity, right? That there will be political entrepreneurs coming up in the coming years, and we might see more and more action there. So the direction is clear. The details are not clear, but the direction is clear. Simply from a power perspective, we know that China today is 9% of world economy. By 2030, estimates go between 15 and 25%. But in general, everyone assumes that it will be the number one economy by 2030. So we know that this direction, once this happens, of course, China becomes the core stakeholder, super economic power, and therefore has a stake in every decision about global rules. In the short term, we also know that China is not very, very active. And there's several reasons for that. Number one, China in a way has been more a norm taker, has been gradually rising into a world order that it didn't create in the first place. So it's been, but policymakers within China have been more used to reacting to a system and trying to adjust into it than to thinking about the system itself and how to reshape it. As a result, they haven't had so far, a large cohort of think tankers, academics or officials who are able, to develop blueprints to think about the future of global governance. That all this explains why it's been slow. In addition, there is a bit of fragmentation of interest. There's several ministries involved. There are different voices pushing in different directions. Maybe foreign affairs trying to push more with the BRICS axis. The economic ministry of PBOC asking for more financial thinking and looking at Asia, looking at relation with US and Europe. So there's that fragmentation, and we are at a time now when the leadership is in transition, is changing. We have new leadership, and so the exact voice and the exact shape of China's future preferences is taking time to emerge. So we sort of know where we are. We know that within 10 years there will be a much bigger proactive voice, but the particular path is very fluid and can be shaped, and in fact can be partly helped by mediating states, including Korea. So it's still a plastic process that's in transit. On the whole, I've been very impressed by Korea's role in G20. We can say that in a way Korea has managed to punch above its weight. I would even say that so far Korea's role and voice has been bigger than Japan's, for example. And so if we look at last year, first Korea put together a very large team. I'm told it's over 200 that worked in that team under the presidential's office, under Dr. Sakong-il. And actually I've met Dr. Sakong-il. And he and the president have put a lot of importance on global governance and G20. So they had a very, very dedicated team, and they really invested a lot in this, maybe more than some other chairs. So that in itself, in the process, made a big difference. Then when we look at the results, I would say that the Seoul Summit had a number of results. In a way, it did not disappoint. There was, among the biggest results, two results that were actually achieved at Gyeongju 2 weeks before. That's the IMF voting rights, the change in voting rights, and the Basel III agreement. And then, in addition, the safety net that you mentioned, which in itself, some elements are still ongoing now under the French presidency, but it really put the momentum on this process to help developing and emerging countries face financial crisis. Also, the Seoul Development Consensus, which really again put this on the agenda, and now the French have to continue with it. I've also been told that as part of the Troika now, the Korean government is still quite active with the French and played an important role in mediating the decision in February and April to have those indicators, to have these economic indicators to solve current account imbalances. So on the whole, lots of action, a strong commitment to global governance, some deliverables. There was, of course, discussion about this issue of the renminbi and the tension between U.S. and China, which captivated a lot of the press attention back in November. So on that front, yes, it's been a little harder for Korea to play that mediating role between U.S. and China. And maybe it's in part because the Korea-China axis is a little weaker than it could be at the moment. I mean, there have been tensions due to other factors. But it's also because China is only gradually coming up with its voice. It's taking time to really make proactive choices, and therefore is hesitant, is prudent, and makes it slower on bigger issues. And the last thing to mention is that there's also a lot of track 2 activities led by Korea. I'm very impressed. Last month I was in China for the whole month, trying to meet all kinds of scholars and officials, and almost every single one that I met was either in Korea, returning from Korea within the past week, or on its way to Korea. And it shows something, right? So first there was the Jeju Forum, which is every 2 years, brought this time 130 Chinese officials and scholars. That was last week. And that included G20 discussion, but a broader discussion on Asian integration, etc. Then there is the NEAR Foundation, created 4 years ago, which had a sort of semi-confidential meeting with officials from the 3 countries. It's about 3 countries, Korea, China, Japan. Just this last Thursday, and several high-ranking Chinese officials I was looking for were there, so I was able to catch up with them there. And even though they are not able to meet results yet, they were discussing things like monetary union between Asian countries and those kind of issues. So Korea has put itself as the hub for all these track 2 activities. I'm learning that there's a new research center that's created probably now or next month for G20 and global governance. And finally, now the Japan, Korea, China summit 2 weeks ago in Japan created a permanent secretariat, which will be based in Seoul. So all this is connected to this effort toward global governance. And so Korea, yes, is very, very active. Good idea. Even though there are obstacles, right? Usually officials, bureaucrats, politicians are not used to working with NGOs. NGOs are very carefree. They have a very, very different culture, right? Not very formal. So there's usually some obstacles sometimes in official NGO cooperation. But it's worth making effort, finding platforms, finding avenues, because NGOs can do 3 things. And actually, it's not just NGOs. There's NGOs, also academics, also second-tier foundations. I mean, this is a broad spectrum of non-governmental actors. So first, they gather a lot of information. And we are at the time of critical juncture, I mentioned, where we need lots of ideas, originality, and innovation. We face really large systemic questions. And NGOs and academic entrepreneurs or foundations can come up with a lot of novel ideas. They have creativity, innovation. And so that's very, very useful to have those being channeled into the policy process. Also, NGOs or other actors are very good at building informal contacts across boundaries. So for example, now when we see that there is a gap, there is an opportunity for more work, and it's difficult between China, Japan, and Korea, probably it's much easier to build first at the personal level, NGO linkages, academic linkages, foundation linkages, etc. So they can prepare in a way, not just ideas, but they can even prepare the feasibility path of those ideas before it's doable for the governments to step in. There's less encumberment in some way, there's more freedom in their action. So then the issue is how to make it work. So probably, we're not talking of having NGOs at the meetings. That often doesn't work, the mix of cultures, etc. But probably having ex ante some cooperation processes, an occasion to have events with a mix of NGO and academics, entrepreneurs, to have that fertilization of ideas, and maybe also after summits a debriefing afterwards, ex post. But involving NGOs, I think it's a very good idea. Finally, I could add it's probably good for legitimacy as well. This is a way for governments to link with voters, with the people, and build up legitimacy for the actions on global governance. So, very good idea. So first thing to notice is that actually two things. One is that France is very, very motivated and very active. There's a strong interest in France for G20 since 2008. In part, it's the French culture. That if you notice, actually at the G20 summits, there are more French than any other citizens right now. Until recently, Strauss-Kahn, head of IMF, until recently, Pascal Lamy, head of WTO. When there is central bankers, Trichet, the head of central bank, is a French. So there's that tradition of thinking big and asking big questions and thinking big international regulations. And the French people are genuinely very, very interested, and they have been sort of more shocked than many other citizens in some ways by the financial crisis of 2008. So it's a very, very lively issue. But we have to say as well that 2012 is a tough year. It's a tough year to achieve big things because we are in a pre-election phase in almost every major country. 2012 in the US election, China leadership transition, French election, Britain is just done, but Germany will have election. Japan is in political chaos. So, Korea is stable, but the elections are coming up in a couple of years. So this is a year that's more difficult to make big issues. So most likely, despite the initial great hopes, when the French launched their agenda in August last year, they talked of a permanent secretariat. They talked of, big change in global governance. Probably now they have scaled down a bit. We have to look at what's achievable realistically by leaders that are heavily constrained domestically. So they're looking at commodity prices and food security. So there's hope that maybe a few guidelines, maybe a few resolutions or commitments to try to have agreements in the future to curb that is possible. There is also work on global capital flows and capital controls. They have hope still now that there might be a declaration or an agreement on the conditions under which capital controls are useful. The French initially had even hoped for a transaction tax, global transaction tax, or Tobin tax. That doesn't look in the cards. Too much opposition, too complicated to achieve. But there might be at least something on the capital controls. They work hard on the monetary system, the future of the global monetary system, and they had hoped that there might be at least a guideline, a pathway toward the expansion of the SDR and inclusion of the renminbi. They prepared that with the Nanjing meeting in March. This may not be achievable, but there may be something, creating the pathway for the future about the monetary system and exchange rates. They are talking of institutionalization of G20. Probably the secretariat is not possible, but a troika that's more institutionalized is possible. So all this, some of the achievements that are possible. In addition, here from the Korean side, that there is expectation that there will be further implementation on the developmental side and on the financial safety net side. There are a few more agreements to expand what was decided in Seoul that are expected. So in general, so no enormous thing, but a lot of medium-sized deliverables that probably over time institutionalize rules. It's probably not enough yet, given the systemic risk we face and the requirements for global governance. We're probably still a little under what is hoped for, but it's already, at least the ball is rolling, there's progress, and the G20 is alive.